Hello watch enthusiasts. Today I'd like to talk about watches, specifically for diving watches, specifically watches which are made for smaller wrists. So these are mid-sized pieces, and just generally more classically sized watches rather than these new large 42mm and up watches, which a lot of brands are producing these days. So the first watch is the Seiko SKX 013. So this is the SKX 007's baby brother, if you will. At 36mm, it is a traditional mid-size watch, but still retains those typical features of the SKX line. In terms of the dial of this watch, it's very much the same as the SKX 007, although it is smaller as to be fitted into a 36mm case. The bezel is also very, very similar in design, but again, resized to be smaller. The hands, however, are different. All the hands are actually different. And I personally like this new design because the hands are more rounded on this version rather than being more blocky, like the 007's hands. Now the crown, for example, is still the same, so it has that very large, easily used crown at the 4 o'clock position. Its water resistance is also the same as the 007's at 200 meters, which is a perfectly acceptable depth for any dive watch. Now this photograph shows the SKX 013 next to a 009, and the size difference is very clear. Along with the hands, you can see that the 009 has the loom pip on the back end, on the counterbalance of the second hand, whereas the 013 has it at the tip, which I think makes it more legible, and I personally prefer it. In terms of size, though, there is a difference. It's 42mm to 36mm, and I think 36mm will fit anyone with a 6.5-inch wrist or 6.75-inch wrist and below very nicely, because I personally don't like watches hanging over the edges of my wrist, and I have relatively slim wrists for a man. So I would probably go with the 013. Now for a slightly higher tier of watch, the Christopher Ward Trident C60 in 38mm size is probably the best bet. Now these are very, very well made. I have tried one, and they are extremely well made with some of the best feeling bezels there are. These are of course ceramic bezels, so they're scratch resistant, just as scratch resistant as the sapphire crystal on the front. They equally won't lose their colour over time, which is really a nice advantage. The bracelets on these watches are also superb, with very good deployments and dive extensions. Now these watches are water resistant to 600 meters, which is fantastic for a small case size, because a lot of manufacturers actually reduce the water resistance on their smaller watches, which is a shame, whereas here Christopher Ward have really proven that that needn't be the case. Although these watches don't feature a helium release valve, which does mean that it wouldn't really be possible to reach those depths with this watch, but regardless, it's an extremely good feature and a real feat of technology. Inside these watches there is either a Sleater SW200 or an ETA 2824, so they're very reliable movements that can be serviced fairly easily. Now in this photograph you can see the different sizes, so that's the 43mm versus the 38, and you can see the size difference is immense, but the 38mm is definitely a very comfortable size to wear on the wrist, and also very, very legible, just as legible really as the 43mm. So I wouldn't discount it on the basis that it isn't easily read, because that really isn't the case. As my third example of a really nice watch at a smaller size, I'm going to look at the Omega Seamaster 300M in the mid-size type. So that's the 36mm version of the 300M, and of course the 300M is a classic diver. It's really it's just as recognisable as a Rolex Submariner, and the 36mm really is just as good as the larger 41. So these watches are very small at 36mm, but because of the design of the case, they are still very wearable, and I wouldn't sneer at one at all. Now, as you can see, the crown and the helium release valve do stick out a little bit more on this, but I wouldn't say that's a problem. And on that note, it does have a helium release valve, which does make it a proper professional diver, so it can be used for saturation dives as well as standard scuba diving. Now, these new watches do feature Omega's coaxial escapement, which is a superb design of escapement, because it means it has a longer service life because of the no need for any sort of lubricants on the escapement itself. Equally, it does have a ceramic bezel, which is a very nice feature because, as I said with the Christopher Ward, it is scratch resistant and won't fade over time. So here we have a photograph of a mid-size next to a full-size, albeit of different generations, but they are the same sizes, so that's really irrelevant. So you can see that the mid-size is substantially smaller than the full-size, but still looks fairly chunky and well-sized. So this is a very good alternative for someone looking for a slightly higher tier watch, but at a more comfortable size. And one small piece of information about the mid-sizes is that if you want to buy one second-hand, then they're at much more reasonable prices. You can get an almost new one for about £1,700, which, considering they're new, they cost about £2,400. That's a really quite fantastic deal. Now, finally, this watch is larger. It's 40mm, but because of the classic shape of this watch, that isn't a problem. And this wears very well, and this is of course the Rolex Sea Dweller 4000. So this is the reincarnation of the original Sea Dweller after it was removed from the Rolex range after the release of the Deep Sea. But thankfully they did bring it back, and it sits between the 4,000 meter water-resistant Deep Sea, which is a very large 44mm watch, and the traditional Submariner. Now this does also feature some features which I particularly like because they look more traditional than the modern Submariners. So this features the original softer shaped lugs of the older Submariners rather than the more harsh boxy shape that's been given to the modern ones. It also features graduations all the way around the bezel, which means it's more legible underwater. Furthermore, this watch is also water resistant to 4,000 feet, so that's 1,220 meters, which for a watch of this size is really quite incredible. They've managed to waterproof it to such an extent. Equally, it doesn't feature a Cyclops over the date, which I particularly like because I was never a fan of the Cyclops, and I'd rather have a domed crystal like the one on this watch than the Cyclops. Another nice thing about this watch is it features Rolex's new Clasp, which is just the best on the market. Really nothing else comes close because it has a clipping piece which can be pulled back to release the clasp. It also has the flip over, the sort of flip lock over the top, which gives an even greater level of security. This also features glide lock as well as a dive extension, which are usually not seen together on a clasp. This new sleek and streamlined clasp does also go along with that slimmer case in terms of the profile of the lugs, which means that this does wear smaller than a Submariner. On the side of this watch, there is also a helium release valve, like its bigger brother, the Deep Sea, which does mean that this watch can be used to its full potential of 1,220 meters, without any concern of the watch exploding when one decompresses, which is always a nice thing with a £9,000 Rolex. Now, in terms of the side profile of the watch, it is slightly thicker than a Submariner, as you can see in this photograph, with the Submariner sitting atop the pile, with the Sea Dweller in the middle and the immense Deep Sea beneath it. You can see though that the crown guards, for example, are much slimmer on the Sea Dweller than on the Submariner or the Deep Sea, which is a nice thing to see with those more classic lines. But equally, the Sea Dweller is not at all a thick watch. I mean, it's not that much thicker than the Submariner and much smaller than the Deep Sea. And of course, that case is made from their much more resistant and corrosion-resistant 904 stainless steel. Anyway, I shall end on a photograph of the front of that Rolex. Thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and if you'd like to see more. Thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.